on the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Michelangelo Signorile. He is a best-selling author of Queer in America. He's the host of SiriusXM's Progress 127, editor-at-large of HuffPo's Gay Voices, and author of the new It's Not Over, Getting Beyond Tolerance, Defeating Homophobia, and Winning True Equality. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Absolutely, Sam. Always great to talk to you.
Yes, I got to say, I've been following your work. I mean, for at least now 15 years. When Atrios introduced me to you, at least on print, anyways.
Yeah.
It's I think it's long overdue. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we may have had you on the program before, but it's.
I do like you've actually guest hosted on my show.
I have,
and I don't know if I've actually been on your show, if I've even interviewed you on my show.
Well,
I don't even know.
I don't know.
We chatted at these various events we see each other at all the time.
Indeed. So I want to talk about. I know you were in the court house or the Supreme Court yesterday during the Obergefell v. Hodges case. This is a case that is going to decide two questions in terms of marriage equality. And one being, does the U.S. Constitution require states to license a marriage between two people of the same sex? And does the Constitution require states to recognize marriages that have been that are legal in one state in another state? Let's start there, and then I want to go into It's Not Over. Give me your sense of what you heard in there yesterday in terms of, and just how important this case is going forward.
Well, this is the case that really would decide whether marriage is a constitutional right for gays and lesbians. And what I also realized in court yesterday, it actually would decide that marriage is a constitutional right, period, for heterosexuals, because marriage is a state-by-state institution, and the Supreme Court has ruled that states have to recognize marriages of heterosexuals in other states. But this would really, make marriage a constitutional right for everyone if the court rules in favor in June. And that was question one. Question two was, do states have to recognize marriages of gay couples from other states? If the court were to rule that it's not a constitutional right, if a state doesn't have marriage for gays and lesbians, do they have to recognize marriages from other states? And so that's why it was such a long proceeding. We took a break and came back on the second one. And what we saw was that the same, it seemed anyway from the questioning, the same kind of 5-4 split that we saw in the Defense of Marriage Act case, the Windsor case, where the Defense of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional, where the four liberals on the court were clearly very strongly supportive of marriage equality, and Justice Kennedy kind of, showing that middle guy sort of back and forth, where he sort of showed some discomfort, but he when he spoke more in favor of marriage for gays, it was much more kind of emotional. He was talking about children of gay people deserving dignity and parents who are married. So it seemed like that. But what was different was that the four liberals were much, much more aggressive than they were 2 years ago, and much more well-informed. Much more like we've had it. We've got this down now. And I think that probably represents a lot of the American public at this point. They had all of their talking points, all their facts and figures. Justice Sotomayor was saying, to the Michigan Assistant Attorney General, who was arguing on behalf of the marriage equality opponents, there's been marriage for 10 years now in Massachusetts. All of your arguments have not borne out that it's going to somehow affect heterosexual marriage. All the numbers have shown that it hasn't affected heterosexual marriage. Massachusetts has the lowest divorce rate in the country The birth rate hasn't changed, because they were throwing out all kinds of stuff about the birth rate and this.
And
So
I should just point out to listeners the argument that this lawyer from Michigan was making was that if gay people can marry, the notion of marriage, which he considers to have been the primary function to produce children, will lose its value as a children production machine. I'm paraphrasing,
right.
And therefore, what you're going to see is more kids born out of wedlock. This, like you say, was easily knocked down by the liberals on the court. And Kennedy, who had based his Windsor argument, in fact, I think at the very least, even in dissent, there was only, I think, two justices, Alito and I think Thomas, who bought that notion that this was about that this was not about dignity, that it was just about a child-making machine. Kennedy was turned off by that argument.
Yes, he is someone who really seems to care about the fact that gay people have children as well, and that marriage is something that could be good for gay parents as well if they have children, and that if it was just about those who could procreate, Justice Kagan pointed out, why don't we then have it where you can get married if you can procreate or you want to procreate, and then if you don't want to procreate, you can't get married. So why separate it gay and straight? She posed a hypothetical, why not have people sign something that says, I'm not going to procreate, and then they can't get married. So it was because, they got into the fact that people adopt children and they're not going to, quote unquote, procreate. Justice Roberts, of course, his children are adopted. So,
and I think Thomas, does Thomas have
there
an
was
adopted?
kind of like this elephant in the room, and so I just would say the liberals were more forceful. The conservatives, their arguments were the same. They did not have anything new. And in fact, the Michigan assistant district attorney, he really started to go very far on this procreation thing. And Justice Scalia tried to throw him a lifeline and bring him back in because the others were just decimating him and try to say, well, you don't really mean it's for procreation. You're just saying it's your grief says it's because it's just been like this for millennia. And he said, oh, yes, Justice Kennedy, you're right. So I mean, it was like that kind of thing. The conservatives, no new arguments, and the liberals just a lot more in their war chest to throw out there. On the second question, it was interesting. The second question is a much more conservative principle. Do the states have to honor contracts from other states? And, this is a long, deeply held constitutional principle, the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. And Justice Sotomayor was really, pointing it out but speaking in a very conservative language about it for the other justices. And on that one, we might see perhaps Roberts join the majority, or it could even be others, because that one is pretty hard for conservatives to say, no, you don't have to recognize a marriage from another state. And
we should be clear that if it's found that there is a constitutional right to marriage and to and for people of the same sex to marry, then the second question becomes sort of moot in a way.
Right.
And right. The second question becomes a fallback position, because then if I'm in Alabama, I don't have to have a gay marriage, but I just have to recognize it if somebody from New York moves here. And let me just add one more thing before, because I want to turn to your book. That Ginsburg had a great response to the idea that this has been that marriage has been this way for the millennia. In terms of marriage, she pointed out that marriage in the past has really just been more about a specific power dynamic, i.e., the husband owns the wife, and because the husband was male and the wife was female, and literally the wife becomes the husband's chattel. It becomes a lot more difficult to sort of parse that out when you have two men or two women marrying each other.
Right. This whole idea about the millennia was kind of ridiculous because marriage has changed radically, probably in the last 100 years, and if you in so many different ways to give women and children more protections. I mean, not just were wives' property, but children were to work on the farm.
Right.
That was, you just had children and the wife just took care of the children, and there was no sort of getting the children or a woman out of an abusive marriage or anything like that. So it just was a ridiculous argument because we've changed marriage as we've changed so many institutions in this country because of civil rights and the guarantees of the Constitution in the last 100 years.
All right, so let's turn to your book because I want to start to talk about that in the context of where do you see? I mean, your book argues that to a certain extent, or warns against falling into what you call victory blindness. And I want to talk about that concept, but I also want to talk about your perspective on whether or not it is better, or maybe it doesn't make a difference, for the court at this point to to promote marriage equality as opposed to letting it be by referendum. And I only raise that in the context of there are people who still make the argument that Roe v. Wade was difficult was problematic in terms of a woman's right to choose because it was sort of forced upon people.
Yeah, I think Justice Ginsburg has been very articulate about that, and that was why she wanted this to move the way it has moved. She felt that was too early. She doesn't feel this is too early. She feels that the number of states now that we're at is a number at which the Supreme Court often then makes sort of that final move. Sodomy laws, bans on sodomy were struck down, not when there were, back in the 80s, 1988, they upheld sodomy bans when a lot of states still had them, but by the time they struck them down in I think it was 2003, the same number of states as now have marriage had banned sodomy, something like 33 states. So she sees the timing right. Same with Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage. The Supreme Court punted in an earlier case when less states had ended their bans on interracial marriage. But it was about the same number, 30-something states that had banned interracial marriage, got rid of bans on interracial marriage, so the Supreme Court moved. So it is time. I think that the majority of the public has moved on this issue. But as I talk about in my book, the problem is that, I think for a lot of people in the LGBT community, it's so intoxicating having a win like this. People don't realize that they still have no rights in the rest of the country. People in Oklahoma, 85% of the counties, nobody is getting married who's gay or lesbian because you'll be fired the next day if you got married because you could still be fired from your job.
Right. I mean, I think that's it's interesting because I certainly, perceive this struggle for equality, and I guess I see it in the context of marriage equality, and I think sort of your book is sort of I guess reminded me sort of that's a little problematic as like sort of almost on the downhill of this argument that this is sort of the time where it's coast, like the critical mass has been achieved and now there's a certain inevitability to this, but that supposed inevitability could be a long time without sort of maintaining the pressure.
Yes, and this word inevitable is a problematic word I kept seeing coming up, and it's one of the reasons why I was writing the book. It changes the tactics as well. People start to say we should be magnanimous to our enemies. We should be, very, very, not sore losers, right? Not sore winners, right? Be big about it, and they start to pull back rather than be confrontational. And I think that's where we start to see the problems. And, I think I look at the women's movement, it wasn't just on the issue of abortion, but pay equity, rape culture. They're still battling this backlash because when you pull back, it allows the backlash to grow.
That's, I mean, that's sort of a fascinating take. I mean, we're going to talk to Katha Pollitt, who I think has written a piece sort of comparing the success of marriage equality versus a woman's right to choose. And it'll be interesting to get her take on that. But I mean, what do you think how does that manifest itself, this notion of being magnanimous? I mean, is it as if you're sort of like gently sort of...
Well, I mean, one example I talk about in the book was when Brendan Eich, the Mozilla CEO, resigned after what was really something that was a kind of societal shift that was organic. People within the company and developers who work with Mozilla, and Mozilla is a unique company where people donate their time. A lot of the developers around the world, they didn't like the idea that this guy not only gave money to Proposition 8, he had given money to Pat Buchanan, he had given money to all these other anti-gay causes. They didn't like that he was the head of the company. So they were saying, look, we don't think we want to work with the company anymore. Some web companies said they didn't want to do business with them anymore. I mean, this was the free market in operation, something conservatives certainly should support. But we expected the conservatives, still be hypocritical because they always are. Whenever we do something in the free market, it's censorship. When they do it, it's the free market, right? But what I found was that even many gay activists got worried. Even Dan Savage and others were like, well, this makes us look bad. It looks like we destroyed this guy's life. And Andrew Sullivan kind of distorted the whole story and said that gay activists had called for his resignation when none of them had. No gay activists even spoke on it. It was simply, the business community. So that to me was an example of you pull back, and then they allow themselves to turn themselves into the victim. Newt Gingrich then is on TV saying, this is the new fascism. Right. That's how the backlash grows, right? And, it changes the tactics in that sense. And I talk a lot in the book about how there's also what is known as covering, where gay people, even after they're out of the closet, sort of, just make themselves palatable to the straight culture. Many minorities, that once you attain a certain level of rights, you try to fit in rather than show difference. And that doesn't really get at deep-seated homophobia. It just, makes you sort of present yourself to heterosexuals on their terms.
So I mean, I want to tease this out here, because we're talking about, once you've achieved as a group a certain amount of sort of statutory rights, then it has almost like an internal backlash in terms of the way that you fit into in areas where there is no, and of course there's still, we still have like statutes to deal with when we talk about sort of discrimination at work and whatnot and being able to be fired because you're gay. But there's this other sort of component of like within a social setting, or even let's say in the context, and you talk about this in the book, about the way that the question of things like marriage equality is presented in the media. We would never see a debate between someone who says that whether it's like, in terms of black people or in terms of Jews, let's say that, well, Jews are inherently offensive. I still happen to believe they killed Christ. And that guy does not end up on CNN debating, me about as to whether or not what is it? Is it that notion of like, we have these rights, we don't want to lose these rights, or we have the social status, we don't want to lose the social status?
Well, I have a whole chapter, as you point to, abandoning the media's both sides delusion, right? Not up for debate. We still see basic personhood of gay people debated, on television by people who have been noted as people who put out the most defamatory lies and distortions about gay people. Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council, Brian Fisher from the American Family Association. These have been labeled, hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's one thing to debate policy with people who are dealing with policy. It's another thing to debate with people who simply are saying, from a religious perspective, that you are sinful and you're going to hell. I think that a lot of, gay people are just sometimes so enthralled to see visibility, they don't demand more and say, okay, it's time, for that to stop. We don't put white supremacists on television anymore to debate. I was encouraged, I'll tell you, the other day, for the first time we saw this, Bob Schieffer from CBS actually introduced Tony Perkins as of the Family Research Council, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has labeled a hate group.
Oh, good for him.
And at least if they're going to do it, at least tell us the background of these people and don't put them on as legitimate people who, have not put out defamations.
Right. That's the functional equivalent of thank you for coming on and taking your hood off so that we can see your face.
Right.
Oh, well, good for him. And so, let's just talk just briefly about, because you cite some research in there too about the sort of and I think it's very easy, particularly living in New York and in this day and age, to assume that the closet is gone. But there's research that suggests that in various parts of the country, it is still sort of a dominant factor. I want to talk about that, and I also want to talk about your history back maybe 15, 20 some odd years ago now, of outing people. And I should say that, there seems to have been like two waves of outing. There was that first wave that had to do with the AIDS crisis. And then another wave that was more limited in some way, where people were outed because they were sort of, I guess, explicitly hypocritical in terms of things like don't ask, don't tell, and DOMA. Is that fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. There have been different points where the issue has been, sort of out there in the public, activists using it in different ways. I want to first just talk about the research on the closet, and then I'll come to the whole outing issue. There's a lot of fascinating research in the book. A Google data scientist, Seth Steven Davidowitz, he really didn't even go out to start this kind of research, but he's just started gathering a lot of data from really interesting data sets, because people are putting so much more information about themselves online. And not realizing it. So through Google searches and through Match.com, profiles and Craigslist ads and Facebook, he was able to really determine the percentage of people who are gay and the percentage, and then using Gallup and the census as well, the percentage who are out. Across the country. And, he determined that even though people move to San Francisco or New York or whatever, there really isn't that much of a shift. About every state has the same percentage of gay people. Overall, though, and looking on Facebook, you could see that just little over half identify as gay. And even anonymously to a pollster, there's still a 30% who still won't even identify anonymously as gay. But then when he broke it down by state, he saw that in places like Mississippi, and this was using Craigslist and Match.com, a higher percentage of men are seeking sex on the side with men through Craigslist in Mississippi than in New York, where a higher percentage are seeking relationships on Match.com. And he was able to determine that 80%, upwards of 80% of gay men in Mississippi are married, many of them to women, but gay, not bisexual, deeply closeted. And I think that just shows how deep the closet still runs in this country. the on Google, the highest search term that women search about their husband is how do I know if my husband is gay? That's before how do I know if my husband is cheating? And the state with the highest number of those searches is South Carolina, and then it's like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Now on the outing issue.
Well, and we should also say, I mean, for every one of those statistics, you're talking about a tremendous amount of emotional pain that is either that guy is going through, the family is going through that, and it is in some ways also dooming a generation that will follow them to a similar amount of emotional pain. I mean, because this is a society. If you've got all of these gay men in the closet who are desperately trying to hide from themselves and from their wives and from their families, it is going to put that type of pressure on 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 17-year-olds there too. It's going to be that much even worse, I think.
Yeah, and how it just points to how we need to start at the very young age before people even go in the closet. We need to revolutionize education. We need to teach about LGBT people as human beings, the history, who they are, because you're forcing these kids. They look out there and they're so fearful into the closet, and then they get married. Obviously, other lives are affected. I had interviewed therapists who treat closeted gay men who are dealing with this with their wives and their children, living a lie. I mean, it's a terrible thing. Then it affects them at work, and
right.
How could you be productive? There's probably a huge financial cost to the whole thing. So it's still a major issue. You can get rights, but this is the deep-seated homophobia. The outing issue, as you were talking about, was something I was at the center of 20 years ago, and it was Time magazine that came up with that word, outing. I just saw it as reporting because at that time, I just thought that, it was the height of that late 80s, early 90s part of the AIDS epidemic. There was such invisibility. People were dying. And there were, lies being told about public figures. And when Malcolm Forbes died, I decided I was going to correct the historical record. It was, told to us that he was Elizabeth Taylor's boyfriend, but it wasn't true. They were friends, and he had boyfriends and was out in public all the time. And so I did that story, and it became a huge thing, and that's what Time magazine decided was outing. And I always hated the word because it was kind of a violent word, but it was actually a closeted man who came up with it, William Henry III at Time magazine, who obviously had something to worry about himself, and his wife later wrote to me after he died and told me. In the years since then, there have been activists like Mike Rogers at Blog Active. Right. They've used this more as a tool to expose hypocrites. And I think that's a fine thing to do. I think it's important to do. I think that we need to see the media doing that. But I think, we need to just normalize the discussion in general. And there are other times when the question may be relevant where you ask the question, and not necessarily when it's somebody who's doing something hypocritical. But certainly with politicians who are voting anti-gay, it enrages me that the media does not investigate it when the stories are out there.
Yeah, that is always sort of that I've found just unbelievably shocking. That it is, and it is. I mean, I sort of feel like 20 years from now, hopefully much of that won't be an issue at all. I'm curious from your perspective if you think that, like, in terms of, because, and I don't want to fall into that sort of victory blindness, but, I still have this indelible memory of Bush getting on TV in prime time and basically saying, like, I'm going to have to, really encapsulate in the Constitution that gay people are second-class citizens. And 2004 largely was about him using marriage equality as a wedge issue, and it has been stunning as how it's turned around. I mean, what do you think accounts for that? And then, like, lead into sort of some of those things you've touched on it briefly, but some of those things in your manifesto at the end of the book as to what has to happen next.
Well, I mean, I think that it's been enormous, the change. There's no question about it, and that, in fact, is why it's so intoxicating to people. It's been eons, I mean, generations, centuries. Gay people have been derided, invisible. Finally, we find our voice, in the 60s, along with other groups, only to then face this horrific epidemic and horrible indifference from a right-wing government. It's intoxicating to then suddenly have these big wins. And see George Bush use the homophobia that was still, so public in the culture, and then all of a sudden see these huge wins. And I credit that to, the activists really, really fighting back really hard, and people coming out. AIDS, did a lot of things, and one thing it did was force people out of the closet. And
right.
Dick Cheney has a lesbian daughter. Everybody, no matter what, no matter what family you're in, Republican, conservative, there's likely a gay relative. I think that's done a lot to change things. But to me, getting rights and, even the ability of adults to come out of the closet more, and celebrities being gay, that's all, great and terrific. But as long as kids are still taking their lives because they're gay, 40% of teen suicides are LGBT teens. As long as we keep, teaching kids in school that the way you're a man, and this is in the sports programs, is that you're not like a girl, you're not faggy, you're not, like a pansy. As long as we keep doing that, homophobia is going to continue in our culture, and that's the bigger chunk. Changing sports, changing schools. That's going to be I think, the next big haul.
And how do you approach that? I mean, because I have to say that, particularly following the Bruce Jenner interview, I don't see a lot of other media, frankly, and I was one of those people who was just more disturbed when Jenner said he was a Republican than anything else.
Right.
I honestly, I had no idea about the whole Kardashian thing. Like, I just remembered him from the Wheaties box when I was a kid. And then I just was noodling around last night and came across Conan O'Brien jokes and Larry Wilmore jokes about the interview. And I was sort of like, this just seems ancient and so low end, the sort of jokes and the derision, it just seemed incredibly juvenile to me, from guys who I don't think are in a position to have to be that juvenile.
Well, I mean, in popular culture, and I talk a lot about this in the book, it's amazing too, coming from Hollywood, which is supposed to be the most liberal institution. Late night, comedians, gay and transgender people are still the butt of the jokes. But even in films, there's either, invisibility completely or defamation that is still the same way it was. We see these exceptions, these standouts, and they get blown up, like Orange is the New Black or Transparent, but, they're on niche channels. What you see on broadcast TV is Modern Family, two guys who have no sexual chemistry. Unlike the straight couple, they don't have sex, or we never see them having sex. They're nice guys next door who are good neighbors. They're very sanitized, very sexless and harmless. So, Hollywood is still very afraid of how the public will see gay people, and then you still have this demonization going on late night TV.
I mean, it's funny in terms of to be honest with you, I've never seen Modern Family, but I'm aware of it. But I've always sort of contended too that something like the Will and Grace, for instance, that had a lot to do with the change in society on some level. I'm just convinced that, like, or at the very least, like, I gotta think that if I'm a kid living in, I don't want to pick on a state, but just say, I don't know, Iowa, and I'm watching Will and Grace, the difference between when I was a kid, where, you know, I think it was Billy Crystal on Soap was just sort of like a freak, that would be, at the very least, make me feel not so isolated.
Yeah, and I think that's true. But I think you can never be satisfied. The visibility is good,
right?
And that was good for a lot of people. But then you have to start to look at how they peg you as what you're supposed to be, what box they're putting you in. And it's funny you mentioned Billy Crystal. Here he played a gay character. He recently complained that How to Get Away with Murder, Shonda Rhimes' new show, which I love, one of the characters on there, who I think is an example of, okay, this is what we need to see more of. He's a gay man he likes a lot of sex, just like straight people on TV like having sex. And so there's a lot of, gay intimacy on that show. There's a lot of kissing. And Billy Crystal said, this is going too far. It's one thing to have a gay character, but why do we have to see this? Well, why do I have to watch everybody screwing on every other show who's straight?
Right. The book is It's Not Over. It is available now. We'll link to it, obviously, on at majority.fm. Getting Beyond Tolerance, Defeating Homophobia, and Winning True Equality. You can also check out, if you have Sirius, and I think they have a free, like a month-long thing, SiriusXM Progress 127, and, of course, Huffington Post Gay Voices. Michelangelo Signorile, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. Really great talking to you. Thanks a lot.